and taking it somewhere, as well as those with disabilities, right? Not everyone is composting toilets aren't necessarily fully accessible to all. And so that's definitely a conversation that we will bring up later again, but it's very important nonetheless. Many people were just satisfied with their current system. They're like, I don't need it. I'm good with what I got. And then again, we see that latrine experiences and triggers. And so this is an example of the maintenance and labor testimonials where they just felt it would just take way more work than they would like to invest compared to a conventional toilet, which they're used to, right?
And then another thing was that we have our other quote, which is somebody saying, I live in the sky. So this was referencing to a participant whose house is on stilts, and they have people who live below them that aren't necessarily attached to their home. And it would be borderline impossible to build a composting toilet in their home. And that was a really good point of there are houses and places where it just isn't necessarily feasible for these people to have a toilet like that. And that was an interesting thing that got brought up and something that we need to keep in mind when we think about technologies like these.
So with those that said maybe, we had quite a few maybes, and it was really kind of varied in some of the responses. Most, again, mentioned the water and environmentally friendly aspect, which I think overall trends to be a very crucial component, which I don't think many of us are surprised at. But there was also quite a few people that just really wanted more information. They were really fascinated by the concept, really interested in learning more. But before they could commit, they just really needed to fully understand how the system works and all the pros and maybe cons that come with it. And then one person had mentioned children. Specifically, when you have to use a composting toilet, usually you have to throw in the virutas de madera, serrín, or the wood shavings, right? And so one was concerned about their children being very small and just like playing with all of the wood and making a mess, right? And so that was, I feel, a valid concern. Again, high maintenance and labor, very concerned with how much time and energy and effort is this going to take for me to do, right? Housing structure, so back in with the I live in the sky situation, are all houses capable really of holding these kinds of systems? Satisfied with the current system, similar to latrines, so that uneasiness about, okay, well, they're still kind of similar, I don't know. Education, so maybe specifically for educational aspects. And then someone did mention that they felt like it would be low maintenance or less maintenance and labor compared to a conventional system. So in this case, this is a quote about cost. There was a lot of people who had mentioned cost as well, and that uncertainty, again, with the needs more information is where that goes, like gets lumped into, because cost was a huge thing. If you don't know what it is, if you don't know the process, you don't necessarily know the cost that it's going to take, not only to install, but to maintain. And so that was that's where a lot of hesitation came from, was specifically how much do these systems cost to install and maintain. With management systems, we asked if we showed them this wonderful little graphic and asked what management system they felt would be best for their community. And so 43.8% of our participants had said centralized or centralizado, hybrid was 40.6%, and then decentralized was 15.6%. So we asked what kind of systems they would prefer for their community or think would be best and why. So for centralized, the largest one was quality control and regulation. A lot of people did express that there's a lot of irresponsibility happening in the community as far as making sure that septic tanks are being well constructed, maintained, and are being inspected every so often. And so a lot of people felt that quality control and regulation would be a huge benefit for the centralized system and would lead to less pollution. Convenience was also a really big one, as well as population size and density. Population size and density was really interesting because a lot of people are very basically aware that Santa Elena, for example, or maybe some areas of Cerro Plano are a little more dense, and therefore it would be really good for them in that case, whereas maybe for those that are more rural or have much larger property size, it might not necessarily be as needed. For hybrid, the ones that came up the most are, again, population size and density for the same reason as the centralized system. Geography and location, so the specific like topography of this area was a factor in why they chose hybrid as opposed to just centralized. And then we have community-based, which I thought was really, really interesting. There were a lot of people who had discussed how a hybrid system may require people to work together and may require more community effort to be more responsible with their wastewater management. And then for decentralized, the biggest one was cost. There weren't a lot of people who chose decentralized, but nonetheless, cost was a huge one, especially because these are all systems that people are not very aware of, especially if you've lived here for a really, really, really long time. This is the only one you know. And so that's also why there's some people who have mentioned that they need more information on it as well, because they just aren't familiar with these other aspects or these other management systems. So we asked two ranking style questions. This is the first one, so we asked for, this is specifically for a centralized system. So hypothetically, if the Canton of Monteverde were to get a centralized system, what would be the most important aspects of that system for you? And so what was really interesting and expected, I think, for this area, is that the highest one, the one that was chosen as most important, was that it reduces water pollution. So for a centralized system, it was very, very imperative that it reduces water pollution, so much so that everyone responded in the same way. So most people actually responded with reducing water pollution being their top most important one. The one that they felt was the least important, which I also thought was really interesting considering the high tourism that kind of comes around and the foot traffic, was that it was least important if it causes low disruption to street traffic to install sewer lines. So when we are installing a whole centralized plant, we have to dig up a bunch of stuff, go into people's homes and things like that. And with that understanding, it was still chosen as like the least important one out of all 5 of those. And then this one's kind of a little bit boring, but it goes hand in hand with the prior ranking. So this is, as far as resource recovery goes, what is really important for aspects of resource recovery for people. And the one that was chosen as the most important was water for reuse in agriculture, which I think really goes hand in hand with a lot of the conversations people have with that water conservation and environmentally friendly aspect.
So we also asked for, again, in this hypothetical situation where there is a centralized system, what people would be willing to pay, if at all, for a centralized connection. So we did have 64.5% of our participants say that they would be willing to pay for a centralized connection, 9.7% who said that they would not be, and then 25.8% who said that they might be. As a follow-up for people that said that they were willing, we asked them how much would they be willing to pay. And our average was about 11,000 colones, although we did have a larger range, though the range, some people did say up to 30,000 colones, it still mostly skewed lower. They would like it to be about the same cost as their like electricity or water bill, which is kind of what we were expecting. And then for the limitations of our study, this is an exploratory study. This is the first year of a 3-year-long project, so we were really just trying to get in there and get like a bunch of information. So we had a small sample size, we had a very extensive interview guide, and we got a lot of very interesting qualitative data, and we would like to build that we will use to build on in the next 2 years. We were also aware that some of the technical information that people gave us about their septic tanks in the very beginning of the survey were based off of assumptions they made due to how old their system, some of the systems were very old, they've been many years since they've last seen their tank, and especially if we talk about like cost issues, knowing that inflation has occurred and that these are 30-year-old prices, that was something that we needed to keep in mind while we were conducting some of this study. And then for our demographics, we would like to see wider age diversity moving forward. That'd be great just to get more just perspectives from people of all ages across the line. And then furthermore, these are very preliminary findings, and we do have more to come, and we're very excited about this beginning of the longer project. And then we're going to have Eddie come up to talk about more of the interdisciplinary stuff.
Cool. So we want to highlight the interdisciplinary aspect of this study because it is crucial if we want to achieve true sustainability. Engineering, we are very accurate to margin of error. However, we use assumptions. Those are good assumptions as long as we know the limitations of those assumptions. We have equations for various things, that's all fine. But when it comes to reality, dealing with local communities, there are no equations for people. And so it is imperative that we have this relationship between engineering and anthropology so we can both uplift each other for the true goal of achieving true sustainability. Cool. So, as mentioned before, a lot of the times when we were interviewing participants, a big question was, what do we do with these barrels? There's currently no infrastructure, as mentioned before, for anyone to come and haul these away. So what ends up happening is those who already have these systems accumulate these barrels. These barrels are not cheap. They're about $66 US. And so a quote from these participants were, what do we do with the compost barrels when they are full? And as mentioned by Eileen previously, this is an accessibility issue. I cannot lift this barrel because one full barrel can weigh 87 kilograms. That's almost 200 pounds. That is a struggle. We want equitable access to these systems for everybody, and so it is very important that infrastructure be in place to help everybody. Otherwise, these systems have a lower probability of being adopted on top of just we want equity for everybody. Also, another thing that is important to us is the cost of the system when compared to the average wages of people that actually live here. The average cost of a composting toilet, $360,000. The average wage each month is between $200,000 and $300,000, and so that is a huge turnoff. If we want any chance at achieving sustainability and for people to even consider adopting these systems, we need to make sure that it is equitable economically for everybody. And one suggestion we have is having government or local authorities, larger businesses, subsidize purchases of these composting toilets to ease the burden on the people that actually live here. Otherwise, it will be all theory. And another important aspect to highlight and a great example of how engineering can supplement anthropology and how anthropology can supplement engineering is these questionnaires. Those of you who have helped us in our interviews, this may seem very familiar, the criteria and how important they are. These criteria in engineering, when we're doing a life cycle assessment, there are certain social and technical factors that we consider because sustainability includes the economic aspect, the environmental aspect, but also the social aspect. And so in our engineering studies, these are the technical, let's say, definitions, criteria that we use. Maintenance requirements, how heavy of a burden is it on the local people to manage? That manifested in requires little maintenance by users. Appropriateness of technology, how accessible is knowledge to operate and maintain these systems, manifested in appropriateness of technology, but this one should say requires little to low maintenance to maintain. System intrusiveness, potential nuisances for the community such as odor aesthetics. We had on the interview reduces bad odors on the anthropology side. And for seasonal resilience, capacity of the system to handle variable rainfall, we had a criteria that said works well in both the rainy season and both the dry season. And so this is a prime example of how both fields can influence each other and how we can get valuable data through the interdisciplinary work.
So with conclusions and recommendations, we discussed the importance, again, of interdisciplinary research to improve work on social sustainability. It is important to not only discuss the quote-unquote hard science, but also understand the cultural and behavioral aspects of very specific communities, right? So a lot of what we discussed here in Monteverde may not necessarily apply, those results, those themes may not necessarily apply even just an hour away from here. It might be very different. And so it is important to have both that anthropological or that social science and that engineering or more hard STEM kind of sciences together to really understand how these technologies are perceived but can also influence and impact people, right? People who would be using them. There is a need for more information on these systems, right? So a lot of what had been discussed in various different ways through the various different questions we have asked is that they're not certain how to answer these questions sometimes because they don't have the information at hand. So when discussing composting toilets, it's important to have all of that information for them. That was a very big thing, was having the information, the educational resources that are not just educational resources, but they're also educational resources placed within the culture. So making sure that these things are culturally competent and culturally contextualized, especially again when they're also, these are kind of triggers, right? Because although maybe they're not latrines, people do associate them that way. So there needs to be more discussion about, okay, we accept this, but how do we have these conversations about the difference and how do we become more comfortable with them? The other aspect is creating educational materials around specifically using the compost and using the urine. So in these cases, although we didn't really discuss it here, there was a lot of conversation about, okay, I don't know how I would use this, maybe I would use it, but I still need a lot more information, or maybe I wouldn't use it because I don't know. I don't know how to use it. And especially when we consider human feces, there's a lot of safety concerns. And so being able to use the compost in a very treated, safe way was extremely important. But people were very much interested in using it. So I thought that was a really important aspect, is that there just needs to be a lot of educational materials that are literacy accessible and just accessible in general as far as dissemination goes. I also had mentioned, especially as part of my own personal research, that it's really important to involve children and young adults in these conversations and in these research processes. Children and young adults are just such a wealth of knowledge and of new ideas and perspectives, and it is really important to have those conversations with them, especially if we want to be in conversation about long-term sustainability past our generations. I also thought it was really important that we discuss and have these conversations with elderly folks and people with disabilities, because from my own experience with my research, people with disabilities especially are just a breath of creativity and adaptation. And if there's a will, there's a way, and it's just about adapting and working together in community with the different aspects. If you can meet the needs of those that are most marginalized, you will meet the needs of all. And so, yeah, that was it. One more slide. Thank you.
He's very excited.
Thank you so much for your presentations. Both were great. It's very clear that you guys understand your science and how to add to the community with your knowledge. Can I ask about the first presentation? One thing about
Yeah,
the science.
do we want to have everyone come up to answer questions?
So you mentioned that in order to have the microbial community decompose the material in order for it to be used, you will need to get at least a couple of years maybe, and then have it analyzed by something like the UCR and confirm that E. coli levels are fine. So you see the community being able of implementing such system, like at this scale, like what are the biggest challenges you guys think are for implementing that here?
I would say the biggest challenge is information, access to information about these systems. Because we have no infrastructure, a lot of the questions are up in the air, like you said. Who is going to certify that this compost is well and safe? On top of this is very new for a lot of people, the idea of using human feces, something that comes out of our body into our plants, something we eat. There's very valid concern towards that. You know, we can say what the science says, but what really matters is how people think about it and how people understand about it. And so with more information being available to the local community, we build trust through those systems. Also, the more systems are built and proven to be reliable, the more confidence you will have from the local community. So I would say our biggest issue is that this is still very new technology. Our early adopters, bless them, they are at the forefront of pushing these technologies. If we had more early adopters, we would have more information and more evidence to show people, hey, this is a reliable system. This will not make you sick. This will not produce bad odors in your home. And so I would say that's one of the biggest challenges. It's still very new technology.
And to add, one of the conversations that we've had quite a bit between participants, some participants, and then ourselves as researchers is the idea of this location, right? So Monteverde is very much a tourism foot traffic space. It's very high in tourism, very high in foot traffic. And so the possibility of a push towards getting businesses on board, I think would be really good, especially if we're considering resource recovery. So for example, the Santa Elena Asada already has a system in place that they're working on with compost, but specifically with organic materials from restaurants. So they're working with businesses to collect those compost materials and creating that compost, creating the compost from organic materials, and they are already selling it to folks, to other businesses for use in replacement of, for example, synthetic fertilizers or in supplementation of synthetic fertilizers. So it is not unheard of already with certain aspects. I think once we have more information and once there is more of a conversation around businesses, I think businesses really have a good opportunity at being kind of the, not forefront per se, but of highlighting the systems. And because of their high foot traffic, there may be more studies and more results that come at a faster pace because of that, compared to, for example, one home with 2 people living in it and a composting toilet, right?
Thank you. Well, I have another question while the others get their questions. So, yeah, on that topic of the private industries, you did not include that in this study yet, right? So, well, first question would be if you're considering doing that, following up. And second question related to that is, yeah, because we here in the canton, we socialize a lot the responsibility of solving these problems, but the earnings that are causing most of that environmental damage is privatized, of course, because and sometimes even the owners of these industries, they might drive electric vehicles and seem like they're being sustainable, but actually their industries sometimes are actually causing a lot of environmental damage, and there's no accountability, responsibility, or justice about that, or some system. We're like dragging behind a lot as a community to maintain accountability in this. So I think we have like a big problem with monitoring and accountability in that sense, and with that context, not sure how this kind of research could add up for this change that we need to do to make them accountable, responsible, and to enhance justice in the canton about it.
Absolutely. So to discuss the 2 parts. Yes, we have another section. So this is a 3-part study over the course of 3 summers. We do also have our faculty who are actually going to be interviewing stakeholders, so hotel owners, restaurant, whoever will talk to us that does a business, basically, because some people won't, right? And so that is an aspect that we are going to be working on, so that's something that you can keep an eye out further from now. The other aspect is that you had just mentioned. What was the second part?
Socializing the effort to solve the problems and.
I lost my train of thought.
Okay.
If I remember, I'll go back to that.
One aspect is that non-point source pollution, which is sources of pollution that enter the environment from nondescript sources. So say gray water flowing through a gutter on the side of a street, or a plume of groundwater pollution moving through the subsurface. They are intrinsically difficult to monitor and intrinsically difficult to tie to a given polluter. That's just kind of the nature of it. So instead of having like a stick approach, carrot and stick, where you are incentivizing or de-incentivizing, a lot of modern solutions to these kind of issues really focus on providing governmental, economic, or social incentives to deal with wastes in other ways. So how I think that would look for us in this study beyond what Tylene has spoken about, is really not just involving the stakeholders that include people who own businesses in the canton, but also involving people like yourselves who have these questions and who have these concerns and who may even have ideas. And putting those two groups of people together in an academic space, kind of with this policy background knowledge, I think is, while not an answer to your question, maybe a means whereby an answer could be found.
And to that point, because I remember my train of thought. And to that point, although this is not going to, this study may not necessarily answer all the questions you may have, this study is a good foundation for further studying. So one of the things that we have discussed a lot is policy, right? Understanding the different policy aspects, the newer policies, but not even just that, also the implementations and enforcement or lack of enforcement with these policies. So I think that this is where anthropology really kind of comes in handy, where it is this discussion of the different social actors, whether it is community, local residents, businesses, or policymakers, or those who are supposed to be policy enforcers, having that understanding and that more ethnographic or long-term studying of these interactions and these negotiations between the different levels of politics, I think would be really crucial and really important, and I think that could really help with answering some of those questions and see where the dynamics lie.
Thank you very much.
Awesome work. Thank you so much. This is very exciting. It's been great having you all here, and really exciting to see these really preliminary results, because you said, like you said, it's a 3-year project. I'm sorry you said it and I didn't catch it or write it down. What's the comparison of like the total life cycle cost of a composting system versus a septic system? So you have the 360,000 kilometers approximately for the composting system. How does that compare to septic?
Includes the environmental and social and economic aspects. We also do something called a life cycle cost analysis. And so, unfortunately, we did not get to complete that thoroughly. But as mentioned before, the composting toilet system is about half the price of a septic tank system. And that is mainly due to the cinder block, the cement, and the steel rebar that are needed to build a square septic tank. Those are pretty pricey compared to the composting toilet, where the dominant contributor to those costs is the PVC pipes. So overall, in terms of cost, as far as preliminary data goes, the composting toilet is about half the price of a septic system. And not to mention the economic benefits of selling this compost, of reusing this compost. That also plays a big factor into the whole life cycle, as you mentioned. You want to look at it from the start, from capital costs, all the way down to benefits, selling these or applying it to your agriculture, and then how much you sell your agriculture for. And so we are going to do a more thorough investigation on that. But if you want to get into more specifics.
No, it's more about that, those capital costs at the beginning. And it's something that I think is important to keep in mind too, is that at least from what I've seen in my understanding, if you were designing a home that had, say, 2 bathrooms in it, that would probably double the cost if you were going to do composting systems versus septic, where it would be like an extra toilet and some more piping. So it's just something to think about.
I think the other aspect too that we will probably discuss with the life cycle assessment is time and labor, and how from what we've seen, a lot of our participants who have septic tanks, many of them have just never maintained it. So there is no time or labor really being spent unless it fails. Whereas a composting toilet, I believe, on average, a barrel gets filled every 6 months or so. And having to do that, plus the more maybe sensitive aspects of cleaning it out properly, especially to not compromise the compost, right, is also really important to take into consideration.
I was just curious about, you guys showed the chart for the yes, maybe, no.
Which yes, maybe no, there's a few, I think.
The one for, it was like, would you use one of these, I don't know, the most basic one? But I was wondering if you guys had any comments on how Costa Ricans feel about it versus foreigners.
That is a great question. And I can give you that data later if you would like to take my contact information, because we do have that, right? Since we do have demographics as far as those who are Costa Ricans versus maybe those who are expats, I can definitely provide you with those statistics. We just haven't been able to go super in-depth in the analysis quite yet, but I'm sure that there's probably something there, maybe. Yeah.
Adding on to that, because that's a great question. Did you guys ask any questions about like involvement in community organizations or maybe jobs? Like if I work for the Institute, I'm much more likely to want.
We did, oh, sorry. So we do have those statistics as well. We did interview, so there's a few things. I agree, yes. Those that maybe work at MBI or even at the Friends School, or those that maybe already have a composting toilet in their home but also have a septic tank, there may be some differences in how they respond versus those that work at a restaurant or work in maintenance or construction somewhere else. And so as the same situation, I can definitely get those statistics for you to see if there are any differences. The other thing though to keep in mind is that our sample size is very small. And so although I am more than happy to provide that, I just want to make sure that it's understandable that this may not necessarily be representative of the population, especially for that reason alone, because we do have quite a few interviewees, quite a few participants who do work here. Not entirely, there was a good diversity, but nonetheless we do still have a few. So.
Yeah, and to add on to that, during our investigation and talking to people who have a lot of experience in this, one of the things that came up was that when you involve the community in the building of, let's say, a composting toilet and then the drain field, you involve the kids, you involve the family, and then they each have a part in actually digging stuff up and putting the rock in, there's a higher probability that they will actually use that system versus if somebody just comes, builds it all by themselves and just like places it there. It's like I'm not really sure exactly like the technical terms behind it, but it is a lower probability that the local people will use it. Something about involving the community and the kids is just helps develop that connection, helps develop that trust, and to motivate them to actually use these systems.
The composting toilet is a new idea here, but there are several in the community. I'm wondering how many there are, how prevalent it is in North America. Like, is this something that's becoming popular there? Or I've lived here a long time,
So yeah, of course. So I will say some things, and then Katie, if you would really love to chime in on that, that would be great. So all those composting toilets seem new. We've seen in like even the laboratory archives conversations and installations of composting toilets in Costa Rica, dating back to like I think 2000 possibly. So they're not necessarily new, but
the first one was in Chunchis a long time ago, and I think that's another question I have, is the Ministerio de Salud, what their attitude is towards this, because the latrine in the Friends School is like, they don't know that it exists, you know?
So the regulation that has finally like accepted, okay, composting toilets are fine as long as they meet the certain requirements is relatively new. But it is something that I believe, from what I've been told and from what I've read, that it is approved by the Ministry of Health. And then Katie, if you wanted to touch on some of
And I
that.
have another question for you.
For those of you who don't know me, my name is Katie Van Dusen, and I'm the coordinator of Procuma, and we've had a team of people working on composting toilets for at least 6 years or more, and helped to, for example, install the composting toilet at the Friends School and Baja and elsewhere. And we've been prototyping the designs, constantly trying to improve upon them. And I want to acknowledge that Bosque Piano S.A.A. has been one of our sponsors and helped us. This is really fantastic. I'm so excited to see a room full of people talking about composting toilets. And I think that helps to answer Carol's question about the normalization of it, is that there's more and more interest here in doing it. It does definitely help when they are at institutions that people are using, so that they've got a little bit of experience. with it. I can't answer the question about the commonality in the United States. My experience in the United States is with Platus multrums primarily, and that tends to be in institutions, including national parks or places like that that are trying to be sustainable. Platus mulchum, looked at that. It's a system where another company comes in and installs the system, and it costs a lot of money, and they've got a set way of how it's maintained. The compost, you've got to go underneath and move it around a little bit, and it does not come out treated. I don't really know where the biosolids generally go from the different Platus mulchum systems. It's also very expensive. I do know of some people, like Mark Fabian was the person who introduced us to the system that Fern, whoops, I'm supposed to make this. To the earth auger system, and I don't think that's very common in the States. It's not common in the States, but he had it, but I think he also had it more not attached to a house. I'll try not to go on forever about this, but I do think that the experience this weekend at Mamma Mia and having the composting porta potties is an example of how I have not heard any complaints yet about the smell, about the use of those toilets at all. I think that for the most part that was a positive experience for people, and I just want to say I'm really excited about moving towards the normalization of this. We have a long way to go to really improve them so that they're ergonomically good, so that when somebody sits down, they know that the pee and the poop are going to go in the right places, so they know what to do. We have been improving on the materials, and they were at Mamma Mia, and I'm working with people who do the cleaning of the toilets to get their feedback on how to make it easier to do that next weekend. It's scheduled to meet with the people here. So any feedback that any of you have for how we can improve these systems in any way, would welcome your input. Other people who are working on this, Mark Fabian, Gabriella McAdam, Steve Abbott, Andrew Gates, there are a couple other people on Orlando Reyes, who has actually physically built these systems. We're some of the people you can talk to, and maybe the users here who have them in their homes who are willing to raise their hands, they could also be willing to. So Tim, Elaine, and Fern and Sophia are all people that we can talk to as well. And I'm really sorry I've got another commitment, so I have to go. But thank you. This has been really, really wonderful, and I look forward to having a copy of the report, the presentations. Ministry of Health. I was going to say that. Ministry of Health has a regulation for composting toilets. It's really interesting though, because you can only use them where there isn't a centralized system where the water is being taken away to a treatment plant. We don't have that, so it's fine to use them here. But our system is much better than the system they described. They're describing something that's, when you go to their information, that is more like an outhouse. It's what was really common in Panama as a abonera, una latrina abonera. Our system really contains the biosolids much better. And by the way, the idea with those barrels is not to pick them up; it's to use a dolly to be able to move it around with a dolly, so it can be more accessible for people. we needed to have permission from the Ministry of Health for having them at Mount. And we were given that permission. It was really interesting. They said we had to keep the barrels there for 3 weeks, and then it's okay to take them away. I think that is a completely random number. We are leaving them there. They're sealed. We're leaving them there. We will take them away, and I'm still figuring out where they're going to go live while they're being treated so that there are no pathogens in them. If you want to help me with that, let me know. So thank you very much to everybody. Thank you, Kate.
I believe you had a question.
Yeah, I was just curious if there was an education factor to all this, because it's great that we're having this conversation in this room. How does this conversation leave this room? And how do people learn how to actually deal with their septic tanks and their compost for this? Because it's something that ideally we want to be accessible to everyone. So is there a plan for that in years or even with this preliminary research?
You want me to touch on that? So as far as our applied implications go, the idea is hopefully that there will be either, whether it's an organization like Proclima or even the Ministry of Health, to implement more educational materials, especially those that are, again, literacy accessible and accessible in different modes, right? Not everyone can read and not everyone can see. And so having different accessible materials is really crucial. That is not something that we in particular are going to jump the gun to work on, because we are all students who are dying currently. And so, but it is a conversation that we are heavily pushing. It's one of our main implications. It's one of our main suggestions, is that there needs to be a lot more educational resources and materials available for all different systems, right? So the septic tank systems and composting. What do you do with the compost once it's done? How can you use it? How can you use the urine? And even in conversation of the centralized system, right? What does a centralized plant do? What does that look like in different countries that are very similar to this? Or even just in Simposyum, for example. So it is really important to have that transparency, that communication, and education materials. Yes.
Yeah.
If I can add a suggestion to that, there is a collective here that we started. It's called Venas del Bosque. I don't know if you heard about it. So it's a collective of neighbors worried to help foster more sustainable ways of dealing with water in the canton. I think it's been mostly focused actually on environmental education than other thing lately. So actually I don't think you guys have to do everything. Like as far as you start articulating with more and more things in the canton and get more organically tied to more and more things, I think that's actually, you will show that you are actually adding a lot to the canton if you have more and more partners that are helping you progress in these directions that we all need. So yeah, Venas del Bosque is one.
Agreed.
Even though most of this conversation has been about composting toilets, which I think is great, because I think that's the best solution. But I think people should be aware that the municipality and the Asada de Santa Elena are both, have been for several years working toward a centralized treatment plant for wastewater. Some of us have known all about this for several years, but I don't know how much the general public knows. That, they have purchased a piece of land. They're currently designing, making the preliminary design for this centralized treatment plant. And it's not going to be just any old treatment plant. The idea is to take as much advantage as they can of reusing the products, making them into various kinds of fertilizer or whatever, and have as low impact as possible environmentally. So it's going to take a long time, and it's going to take a lot of money, but this municipality is working towards that, and that's a very rare and a very precious thing.
Any other questions?